There is a podcast model that I use to generate leads and to create content while testing ideas, and I'd like to share it with you today. In today's episode, we're going to cover kind of what the approach is to create content once and use it many times. I'm Justin Hitt from Ad Briefing's Copywriting Tips. If you start out with a brief outline or script, you can very often zero in on a topic, delivering some easy to follow steps or easy to follow outcome for your listener so that they can solve a problem in their life or business. Now, the model includes some kind of formula for developing your content, a means of distribution, meaning after you record a podcast, what happens to it, where does it go, and a simple way to actually record that podcast. So let's work backwards. I'm recording this podcast on my iPhone using an app, and there are all kinds of apps, so I won't talk about one specifically, but you can have a device like the iPhone, you can use an iPad, you can use a microphone connected to your computer. Do not make the mistake of making this too difficult. I have mobile devices, I have all kinds of ways of recording, but ultimately the fastest and easiest recording device for you that gets you from idea to recording to syndication, that's the most important. Next, what kind of podcast formulas can you use? Well, you can start with the AIDA formula: attention, interest, desire, and action. You can describe a problem and then some of the pain associated with the problem, and then a possible solution, then a call to action. Whatever you do, you want to make it interesting to your listener. On some of the channels where my podcast syndicates, somebody will listen for like 3 minutes and then drop off. Now, I'm looking for subscribers who will listen to a 15-minute podcast, take some notes, take some action, write with questions. You want to create your podcast or your presentation for a specific audience. Some audiences are garbage and you don't want them on your list. Now, syndication helps you reach that audience, because just because you have a podcast recorded, just because you've spoken for 10, 15 minutes, just because you've published it doesn't mean anybody's going to listen to it. So my podcasts are actually on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, YouTube, and various other channels. My combined distribution is in the thousands, not the tens of thousands, not the millions, but thousands. And I speak to a specific audience. And how do I know that I've actually got listeners? Well, every platform pretty much has stats. And then I use in the description a backlink to my content where they can ask a question. So part of this podcast model is also to offer one of two things from each podcast, because podcasts are really about lead generation. Podcasts is about answering questions. Podcasts are about preparing your prospect to engage you further. So every podcast of mine, I give you the opportunity to ask a question. I even coach you on how to ask good questions so you can get satisfactory and easy to follow results. So in this podcast, I'm teaching you how to use a podcast to reach prospects and what you need to have in that podcast to actually generate prospects. You can offer a topical report or a survey. I've actually got here in front of me notes from 2017, notes from 2021, just kind of an outline here about what I'm calling the daily podcast formula. And the first step I'm offering you here is you might be asking the question, are podcasts useful for lead generation? And I'm saying, yes, they are, only if you're interesting. You actually do the podcast and get them out there, and you've got some model for delivering them in an easy to consume way through as many channels as possible. Now, I've seen people do their podcasts and then syndicate them on LinkedIn, Facebook, all these different platforms. It is a real technical chore to get your content out across all those platforms. But again, it's important because you want to go to where your prospect's at. And some platforms work better than others. Now, I've been getting into lately optimizing individual channels because I noticed that I might publish on one platform and then the syndicated content through what's called an RSS feed. And we're not going to get into any of the technical stuff, but basically when I update descriptions, the updated descriptions don't make it to all of the other platforms where my podcasts are. So if you go on Apple Podcasts, you look for ad briefings, copywriting tips, you'll find my podcast there, but the titles might not be the same as in a different platform because I may be changing and testing titles. There are some podcasts that were published, last year and have 0 listeners on some platforms. They might have 5 listeners on one platform, 0 listeners on the other, but they're the bottom of the ranking when it comes to the number of listeners. So it's okay to go ahead and redo the title and redo the description and try to make that podcast pop a little bit better, get a little bit more attention, because they're not even listening to the podcast. So it wouldn't matter what the quality is if nobody's listening. So you want to do these optimization things. You want to be aware. I actually was checking stats today, and today an episode from 2018 had 2 listeners today, and they listened to the whole podcast. See, it's important. A podcast is valuable and important because it creates a catalog of materials. I have 127 episodes of Inside Strategic Relations. That's a podcast tied to another newsletter. Ad briefings, I've got, I think, 98 published on my main channel, but I found an archive with 100 and some old podcasts. And so basically I had switched platforms, and I had on my local computer all the MP3 files and the descriptions and everything. And when I switched to the new channel, I didn't get a chance to publish it all in the new channel. So sometimes when you write in with your questions, I'll go find an episode somewhere that answers your question already. I'll listen to the episode. I might re-record it. I might go ahead and publish it and then send you a link. So the podcast actually becomes, for me, a means of interaction with subscribers. It becomes my own media. And since I'm on iHeartRadio, I'm on other channels, there is some value and credibility there. So I'm going to where my prospects are. I'm even on Audibles. And so I'm not so worried as much about how many people listen. What I'm concerned about is how many people ask questions. So my podcast solves specific problems for most of the time prospects, people that are not my clients. If you're my client, we could sit down and talk specifically about your needs, create a plan, and then get you solving problems. But the podcast is kind of like a sample. And then if you like it and you want more information, when you ask a question, you can find out about paid consultations, project work, private client work, coaching, all the other things that are going on here. So let me wrap this up. First off, you want to just start with whatever technology you have. Don't worry about having the right microphone or the right mixer or the right anything. Just make sure you're speaking clearly and directly to a specific audience. You want to make sure that when they listen to your podcast episode, they get some kind of action, some kind of next step, even a feeling of confidence that they can approach a problem and solve it is better than they didn't get anything and they just moved to the next podcast. You want to work on your speaking skills to make sure you're clear and easy to follow, and then use some kind of outline so that you can walk through a presentation. The outline is best if it builds on a formula, because that formula can really guide someone from beginning to end and makes it easier for you to read off what's going on or kind of, what are your key talking points. And finally, you want to syndicate your content. You want to make sure that you create something one time. I'm going to record a 10-minute podcast, and that podcast is going to go out on 15, 20, 30 different channels, and then the descriptions, the links and offers all come back to your website or to your telephone number, and so you have an idea how many people are coming from these podcasts. Now, you can use a coded phone number for your podcasts. I used to use an extension on my 800 number, but really I prefer people now to go to my website and write me with their questions, because I was getting too many phone calls that were disrupting my day-to-day business activities, or I ended up having an assistant on the phone who essentially just answered the phone all the time. It was better if somebody writes in with a question or faxes in with a question, because then we could take that question and we could go get you a good answer, and we could do it without kind of a queue-based, without disrupting too much of the office. So again, I do believe podcasts are valuable. I keep doing them because it gets the ideas out there. It starts that connection with a prospect. It helps answer questions. So if I get the same question twice, the second time I can just point them to the podcast. And it ultimately helps a large number of individuals who couldn't afford to pay for my services. It helps build goodwill because they do get consistent results using the advice and the insights that I share. I'm Justin Hitt with Ad Briefing's Copywriting Tips. I want to thank you for listening today. We've been talking about kind of a little excerpt from the daily podcast formula, but just kind of how I'm using podcasts for lead generation and ultimately to help streamline some of the things that go on in the office. If you have any questions about this or any other podcast, be sure to visit www.adbriefings.co.uk and ask your questions. We have a lot of guides and tip sheets that I'll love to send you for free if you're willing to ask your questions, be a little vulnerable, and tell me about the challenges that you're facing as far as building your copywriting, marketing, or business development consultancy. Again, thanks for listening. I'm Justin Hitt with Ad Briefing's Copywriting Tips.